Good evening, everyone. We continue our study in the book of First Kings. Now we are in chapter 17 after a break. I need to level set that we have this background that we are dealing with. In the southern kingdom at this time, the kingdom of Judah, we have King Asa who is reigning. And then in the northern kingdom at this time, we have the Israel king, and he would be Achav. He has a queen or the wife by name of Jezebel. Now, at the end of chapter 16, King Achav had introduced idolatry into the kingdom. And that seems to set in defiance against God, because in Deuteronomy chapter 11 and in verses 16 to 17, it tells us that when they defy God and embrace uh, idolatry, God will stop the rain. But in chapter 16, when King Achav did that, the rain still fell. And that appears to be a clear defiance of God. And they thought that, well, that's not true. Now we enter into First Kings chapter 17, and it begins this way, noun, and this would be the and then after all that said and done, we introduce uh, a prophet by the name of Elijah, and it says Elijah the Tishbite. The name of Elijah really is Eliyahu. And just for our purposes to learn this, Elijah, as in the English, is actually Eliyahu. The Tishbite would be Hatishbi, and that's a name. Perhaps it's from the land of Toshav, and there are a lot of conjectures. But nevertheless, he is Eliyahu Hatishbi, and he comes from Gilad, the eastern shore of the Galilee. Now, what is important for us to understand in the book of Kings, before we go any further, is this. You always see the book of Kings having the names of two kings at any one point in time. Right now, the King Achav and then King Asa. And in the olden days, we don't have the current calendar. And empires uses the start of a reign, the end of a reign, to calibrate timing. And in the Bible, like in First Kings, when you've got the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, calibration of timing is always in which year of the existing king did a new king came to reign, and in which year the previous king died, that corresponds to the other king that is still reigning. So it's always juxtaposed between the two kingdoms. And by that, then the Hebrew people or the Israelites are able to calibrate their calendar. Now, given this background that King Achav had introduced idolatry and the rain is still coming down, then Elijah, the Tishbite, or Eliyahu HaTishbi, was sent to speak to Achav. And these were the words, as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives. Now, this is really a matter of an oath. Every time you read this pattern of a phrase, as God lives, as Jehovah, uh, Elohe Yisrael lives, as a formal oath. And the oath invokes the name of God. So remember, in the 10 statements or in the 10 commandments, you shall not lift the name of Jehovah your God in vain or in any useless way. So, oaths, when invoking the name of God, means that it must be done. And so, if an oath that invokes the name of God was ignored or dismissed, then it means that the name of God was used in a worthless, useless way, and God will hold that person guilty. And so here, Elijah invokes the name of God, says, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives." And you notice this is a bit different from how the previous prophets would have it, that no, thus says the Lord. Uh, and in the Jewish culture, they would debate whether Elijah was actually speaking on his own, or was he told earlier by God, and he said these words as a matter of fact. But in any case, we can be sure that Elijah wasn't trying to be funny with King Ahab, because anyone who deals with the king, we need to understand that the king, whether good or bad, holds absolute authority over his subjects. And Eliyahu is a subject of the northern kingdom. And so there is no way anyone would actually play a joke on the king. And so when Eliyahu says these words, it means that it must be true. It will hold true. So it's like another way of saying this is what God is going to do. But in a more serious way, the oath invokes the name of God. And he says this: before whom I stand, and he says that he is standing to God's face. God is looking at him right now, that there shall certainly be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. Now, understand this, the idea of dew would be the mist that comes in the night. That's meant to water the vegetation. And so basically, it says no dew and no rain until he says so. Now, this is a period which we are not told how long, but essentially, it is to make the words of God ring true. That if they practice idolatry, God says that he will stop the rain. And by this statement, the rain is going to stop. Now, how is that going to stop just because Elijah said so? No, it is God who makes it stop. So now we come to verse 2. Verse 2 says, and then, this word then is an and then, after he says this to King Ahaz, we need to also remember that at this point in time, Elijah is not the only prophet around. According to traditions, no, throughout the period of the history of Israel, there are many, many hundreds of thousands of prophets, all operating on a local basis. But when we are told of the name in the Bible itself, like here in First Kings chapter 17, then these prophets are to be remembered for what they stand for and what they did, because whatever they are recorded applies throughout history. Whereas the other prophets that are not recorded are more localized in their work and hence not recorded. And so later in the chapters, you would hear of prophets. But here we are told of one particular prophet, and we are introduced to Elijah. And the word of the Lord came to him, saying, now remember, these are all the traditional ways. It says the word of the Lord came to him. It it merely means, or it literally means, the word of God appeared to him. Now, in the appearance, it will probably come in the form either of a vision or audible. And he would have heard what God said. And the word of God literally means this is the things that God said, these are the issues that he's taking up, and these are the words he used. In verse 3, it says, "Go from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook of Kerith, which is east of the Jordan." Now, let me just help you understand. If we're talking about the uh, Sea of Galilee, I think we could use the Sea of Galilee as our measurement. And then we have the Dead Sea. At this point in time, if this was the case, right up to this part would be Israel. And he was supposed to run by the brook of Kerith, which is east of the Jordan. So we can think of it as a Kerith river. And here we find Elijah putting up. Now, why is it here at the brook of Kerith and not running down south to Judah? Because Judah would be down here. This no rain situation really applied to Israel as a whole. And God wanted Elijah to stay in Israel, where this particular instruction was invoked, no rain, until Elijah says so. And so in this case, he went to hide in the eastern part of Israel or the northern kingdom by the brook. And the brook obviously has water. And so he is able to sustain himself. And then we also read how God sustained him. And it shall be that you will drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to provide food for you there. God had supernaturally provided for Elijah. And so when there was no rain, they would be hard pressed to plant and harvest, and whatever they had will start to die. And so interestingly, you find that God had placed Elijah to that part of the country and ensured that Elijah was there in the very place where God has stopped the rain. And there would be a what we call a supernatural way of providing food for Elijah. Verse 5, and then, so the so is, and then he walked and did everything according to what God had said. And interestingly, you find that this whole experience is Elijah is showing us his obedience, his engagement with God. He walked there and lived by the brook Kerith, which is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he would drink from the brook. Now, this supernatural way of dealing with feeding Elijah has an interesting observation because of ravens. Now, understand, ravens are unclean birds, cannot be eaten, but can be used. And so you find that in the way that God prescribed for the Israelites, as long as Elijah is not eating the birds, that would be fine. Just like a donkey, a bird, a beast of burden, they could use the donkey, even redeem it and use it for work, but they can't eat the donkey. So a clean and unclean animal is really a reference of eating as the kashrut law is, as well as what can be brought to an offering. But in this case, we find that ravens are used very interestingly, and meaning it's more than one. And there will be enough of these birds looking for food, and God can use nature to deal with Israel. God can use his creation to deal with Elijah. How to take care of Elijah instead of raining manna, for example. God used the birds. Even unclean birds are subservient to God because God made them. So God made the clean animals and the unclean animals, and the categorization is not so strict as to you can't touch them. Categorization is purely for the purposes of Israel to appreciate the rules that God had given them so that they can be a holy nation. So having a donkey work is fine. Having ravens work is fine, but this is a supernatural case. And there was enough for him to eat both bread and meat. Now, how the ravens found, we're not told. There would be water to drink by the brook of Kerit. But it happens, verse 7. This is an and then. After a while. Now, one of the things about historical narrative is that there is a lot of and thens. The idea of and then literally means after what happened in that one verse, after a period of time, whether short or long, depending on the context, the next thing happened. And so we find that this would be what we call sequential events. There's a way of the Hebrew doing storytelling. Very much like Eastern Oriental people, when you tell stories, you can't tell concurrent events. You have to tell sequential events. And so between verse 6 and verse 7, a period of time, at least in our minds, would have transpired. And it was seen that after a while, the brook dried up because no rains came. And after a while, there would be no water from the upstream because there was no rain in the land. Now, this is not a global event. This is a local event and local to the land of Israel, which is actually in the northern part of this land of in Canaan. The southern part of Judah, at least we are not told that it was affected. And so we can assume that this was dealing with King Ahaz. So King Ahaz is the problematic king. And as a king introducing idolatry, led the nation into a cross purpose with God. And according to Deuteronomy 11:16-17, God turned off the tap of the heavens. Verse 9. And when there was no more water, uh, it was deemed that water is more important than food, or perhaps by that time, even the ravens would be hard pressed to find food and bread for Elijah. So God had instructed him, stand up, walk to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon. Sidon is, well, I guess you can say Sidon is further up north here on this side. And stay there, and behold, God said something very strange. I have commanded a widow there to provide food for you. And as we go through the rest of this chapter, you find that it is not so much that God spoke to the widow, it is God made an arrangement with the widow to allow the provision of food to Elijah, and so that he can actually stay there. Now, this word command, and it is a word for command, basically says that God has commanded this event to happen, not specifically commanded the widow. And so the idea or the Hebrew text actually works this way. It says, I have commanded, and the next word is there. Commanded there a widow. Now, of course, the English will put it backwards, but it's just to indicate that God has made a command of this event to happen, not so much as God had spoken to the widow to give her a command. That is what I'm trying to say. God did not speak to the widow. Now in verse 10, it says, and then Elijah stood up, arose, and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate or opening of the city, behold, it says, uh, and it says here, a widow. Now, a woman who was a widow, I think would be a better way of expressing this. Why? Because the Hebrew says this, a woman who was a widow. And so, behold, a woman who was a widow was there gathering sticks. Now, why is this uniquely important? And why is this piece of detail important to us? The narrative is showing us that this woman is a widow. And you need to understand that if a woman is a widow, means she is a woman who is not uh, in a representation of herself, because she has no man to defend her, and she is not at home with the father because she is unmarried. So this is not just a mere woman, but a woman destitute, a woman with no man to provide for her, a woman with no man to defend her. And so we would be given a picture in our minds that this woman is very poor, is destitute, probably going hungry soon. And so Elijah saw her, and he called to her and said, please get me a little water in a cup where I may drink. Now, this word get me is not about to give me, it is literally take for me. It is not give me. See, the idea in the Hebrew, take for me, means it is part and parcel of a request, more like a command. To give me is an appeal to a voluntary free will event. That would be the difference in this idea. So it is not a matter of a choice for the woman, but it is a matter of an obligation that Elijah stepped in and gave this idea to her, and to say, yes, bring me water in a, well, we call it cup anyways, but in the Hebrew context, it's a little container. I think that would be it. And the woman says, as she was going to get it, Elijah, called to her and said, please bring me a piece of bread in your hand. Again, I highlight this word, bring. The idea of bring is also to take. It's like a command. Get get me bread. And of course in your hand means It is not a lot. So these are all little bits of information. Bread in hand is a little bread. A woman who is a widow, poor, destitute, no man to defend her. And with that piece of information, now we can continue to verse 12. Verse 12 gives us this little dialogue between the woman who is a widow and Elijah. And then she says, as Jehovah, your God lives. Now it's quite interesting because we begin to see a little difference. As Jehovah, your God, means that Sidon is not a place of the Israelites. And this woman who is a widow is unlikely to be one of the tribes of Israel. Sidon is not in the land of Israel. And so Elijah had gone further north. And so this clue will tell us that it is your God, but they know about the God of Israel. As the Lord Jehovah, your God, lives. And literally, she's saying, I am telling you the truth. I have no food. I only have a handful of flour in the little bowl or pitcher and a little oil in the jar. Now, what she's saying is this, because Elijah is asking for bread, bring in the hand, she has no food. There is no bread that is already made, but she has a little bit of flour in a bowl, a little oil in the jar, and she's saying, I am gathering a few pieces of wood so that I may go in, prepare for me and my son, so that we may eat the bread that I'm going to make, and then we will die of hunger. And as you know, when there is no rain, it is not a situation where there is a line drawn on the land. And so Sidon is just a little north of the northern part of Israel, and they too are also affected. Now, in verse 13, however, Elijah said to her, this word, however, is also and then. Elijah said to her, do not fear. Do not fear literally means don't be afraid that it will come to this point. Don't be afraid that you will come to the point of dying. Elijah is trying to convince her to say, go do as you have said. Just make me a little bread loaf from it first and bring it out to me. And then afterward, you may make one for yourself and for your son. Now, watch the conversation. Elijah said, bring a little bread in your hand. And so the instruction to her is do make the bread. Whatever you're going to do, make the bread and then bring it to me. And then you can go back in and make a little bread for yourself and for your son. Now, this essentially is a, a challenge, I think, would be for this Sidonian woman who is a widow. If she had made the little bread, that would be what was enough for her and the son. But if this is to be done, and if she is to take the word of Elijah, then then there must be something supernatural that will come out of this. And Elijah explained this to her. For this is what Jehovah, the God of Israel, says. And if that is the case, then this your God is the God of Israel. It is not the God of the Sidonian woman. It is the God of Elijah, which is correct. And so it is the God of Israel, and Eliyahu or Elijah, that would be his God. And he says, this is what the God of Israel says. The bowl of flour, whatever the flour that's in your bowl, that little container, shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil, whatever that's left in that little empty jar, it won't become empty. Now, this idea in verse 14 means it will not become diminished, is the word. It's not the word empty. It will not be diminished. It will not be lessened, which means that as she goes and use it up, she can come back and it will be there again. It will be there until the day that God provides rain on the face of the land. This idea is to convey to the woman that there is nothing to fear. Elijah is speaking on behalf of God and has given this commitment to this woman. Elijah knows that this woman would be the one that God had commanded to take care of him. Verse 15 says, and then she walked and did everything in accordance with the word of Elijah, and she and he, notice she and he, and her household ate for many days. It would be the widow, Elijah, and the son, and perhaps the relatives. And it seems that there is a constant supply of flour and oil. And verse 16, the bowl of flour was not used up. Now, this word here, used up, means fully consumed. Nor did the jar of oil become empty. And the word empty here is lacking. It's just that the English word tends to be a bit different, in accordance with the word of Jehovah, which he spoke through Elijah. Verse 17. Verse 17 again, it says, and then. So some time has passed, and it happened that after these things, that the son of the woman, and it says here, the mistress of the house, that would be the house owner. Now, why is this given to us? Is that Elijah is now staying in her house. She is the landlady, I guess you can call it, the owner of the house. And this woman's son became sick, very sick, and his condition became very grave until he was no longer breathing. Now, this is the actual word. He was no longer breathing. And we will talk about this very shortly. And then she said to Elijah, Why is this happening to me? Why is this a problem now that you're here, that it has affected me, you man of God? And so the woman understands him as a man of God because he talks about Jehovah, the God of Israel. And she knows Jehovah, your God. And you have come to bring me my offenses, my perversions, my sins. And then, as a consequence of that, my son had to die. Now, this is her observation. Her observation is that he was no longer breathing, and so to her, he is dead. Now, is that the case? Now, now, a lot of debate goes back and forth with the Jewish commentators, and it appears that it is likely that he would have come to a point where he is almost dead with very shallow breathing, as if he had died. But he said to her, "Give me your son." And then he took him from her arms, carried him upstairs where he was living. So she must have a room somewhere else, maybe downstairs. And now Elijah brought this child and laid him on his own bed. Verse 20. And then he called loudly to God. This is about calling out for help, and said, "Jehovah, my Elohim, have you also brought uh, evil upon this woman who is a widow with whom I am staying, I'm dwelling, by causing her son to die?" Because he is also thinking, since he is not breathing, he must be dead. The actions that was taken is this. He then stretched himself out over the boy 3 times. Now, this idea of stretch himself out over the boy literally is, if you just imagine, the boy is lying down. And then we have Elijah, something like that, that he would straddle and cover himself over the boy. And it says 3 times. The Hebrew word is quite interesting. This word 3 times means 3 beats. So the English 3 times is correct. He did it 3 times, and then he called out to God and said, "Lord Jehovah, my Elohim, please let this boy's life return to him." Now, we have some challenge with this word. This word, boy's life, is actually nephesh. Return means in his mind, the nephesh left the boy. And so he is lifeless. Let the nephesh return to the boy. And nephesh would be the being, the wind. The idea is that make the boy move again, because the idea of dead means the boy is not no longer moving, not even breathing movement. And so let the movement come back into the boy. I don't think this is introducing the concept that the nephesh can leave the body and then after a while can come back into the body. And so the Jews actually debate over this and says that the boy's life is not extinguished yet, but is almost there. And it says here, and the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah, means God heard Elijah calling out loud to him. And then the life, and this word life is nephesh, of the boy return. Now, the idea of return means come back to where it was, to him, and he revived. This word revive means alive. There is movement. Always be aware that being alive means there is movement. Being dead means there is no movement. And when there's no movement, it's not about sleeping, it is about end of existence, meaning the nephesh has left the body. And so, in the mind of Elijah, he is asking God to cause the nephesh to return. And so, how would one know that something has left and come back? Because the boy appears lifeless on the bed. He was trying to detect any hint of breathing, any hint of motion. And that's what he stretched himself over the body 3 times just to triple check, I guess you can say that. And the nephesh returned to him, meaning the idea that Elijah saw was that the boy started to move again. And so Elijah took the boy, brought him down from upstairs room into the house, and gave him to his mother and said, and Elijah said this, see, your son is alive. And so the idea of see is that it is now visible. Your son is moving. And that would be the idea that is conveyed. Because that's what Elijah had seen, as it is accorded to God. And God somehow enabled the boy to start breathing properly again. And that would be the most likely explanation. It's not so much that the soul left him and then the soul came back. Uh, it is not conveying that kind of a concept. It is conveying that the boy is appears lifeless, appears to have no movement, and so labeled as dead. And God somehow enabled the boy to start breathing properly again. And the boy is moving in that motion, and hence he is alive. We come to the last verse. Then means and then the woman who is a widow said to Elijah, and this is what she said. This word now literally means at this time. This word noun is at this time. I know that you are a man of God. Now, this word know is yada. And yada means I can see, I can experience. And hence there is a knowledge that you are truly a man of God. This would be Ish Elohim, that you are a man of God. And that the word of Jehovah is in your mouth is true, not truth. So you can call this as uh, emet is trustworthy. It is truth. It is true. Why? Because she can actually see, based on what Elijah said, she can see that what Elijah says is trustworthy, truth, and true because the son can come alive again. It is not that the son has actually died, medically speaking. It is likely that he would have been breathing very shallowly and almost at the point of dying. And he started to breathe properly again. And in that sense, we see that the boy is not walking. Elijah uh, brought him down. Now, how did he mean by bringing? It would be the same way that he brought him up uh, and passed him to the mother. So we shouldn't assume that the boy is immediately walking, or the boy is no longer in a lifeless state. And so the idea of know is about seeing. I can see now. Because you have brought my son back, you are true. What you say is true. How is it that when the flour doesn't go away and the oil is still there, she doesn't say any of this? And that's because she knows that life is important. Even to a non Israelite, life is important. The son is alive again, and somehow, without any medical treatment, the boy is now moving and alive and not dead. So, in that sense, the woman now confesses, "You are truly a man of God." That the word of Jehovah in your mouth, when you say so, it is true. And it is interesting to observe, to understand from the narrative that truth is what is real, what can be seen, not believed. Right? It is not something that you just hope that it is true. It is because she has seen what is supernaturally done in this particular event, that God had restored the life and the health of this boy, that he is no longer dying. And she is eternally grateful to him. And with this, we come to the end of our session.